Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into one of humanity's most enduring questions, really. It's deeply personal, too. The age-old debate between free will and determinism and, what it all means for human responsibility.
Right.
So, to kick things off, I want you to think about a really significant decision you've faced recently.
Okay.
Maybe it was a career pivot, a tough personal choice, perhaps a moral dilemma that kept you up at night. You know the kind.
Yeah, we've all been there.
You agonized over it, weighed the pros and cons, and finally you made your move. But here's the question, the really intriguing one. When you made that choice, did you truly choose it?
Or was it just inevitable, the outcome of everything that came before?
Exactly. Was it your will or was it, fate?
It's a question that honestly has echoed through every culture, every era, probably since we started thinking consciously.
Right.
And this isn't just some abstract philosophical puzzle for academics.
Yeah.
It fundamentally shapes how we understand accountability, guilt, merit, even the basic structure of our society.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we're drawing from some really fascinating sources to help us navigate these incredibly complex waters.
Good.
Our main guide is this deeply analytical 1911 philosophical monograph from Dartmouth College. It's called Free Will and Human Responsibility.
Quite a title.
Yeah, and it gives this sweeping historical and analytical view, a really robust framework. But we're not staying stuck in 1911.
Good, yeah.
We're also pulling in insights from contemporary discussions, stuff you find on platforms like Reddit.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And even looking at religious texts about biblical decision-making, environmental stewardship, trying to get a well-rounded perspective.
So a real mix of old and new, philosophical and, everyday thinking.
Exactly. Our mission today is basically to unpack these complex ideas. We want to help you navigate the different perspectives, understand what each side truly means for, your daily life, your sense of self.
And maybe even the future of society. It touches everything.
It really does. We'll look at how different fields, physics, theology, ancient wisdom, modern neuroscience, how they've all grappled with this.
And the goal isn't to tell you what to believe, right?
Not at all. It's to give you the tools to think about it for yourself.
Right, to really engage with the arguments.
All right, let's unpack this. So let's start right at the beginning. Our Dartmouth monograph does this well, framing the central question. It puts it beautifully, actually. Whether the fate of man rests at all with himself or not.
Simple, but profound.
It is. And it's not some dusty academic puzzle, is it? The monograph calls it one of perennial freshness and interest. Every new generation tackles it.
Because it's always relevant.
Yeah.
It touches something fundamental about being human.
Exactly.
At its heart, you've got these two opposing viewpoints, right?
Yeah.
Two really distinct answers about how we understand human action and choice.
Okay.
On one side, you have the determinists. Their answer is, pretty straightforward. They believe that man, society, everything is entirely determined by what they call efficient causes.
Efficient causes, meaning like preceding events, things that make something happen.
Exactly. Like one domino knocking over the next. For a determinist, every event, every choice you make, every single outcome in your life is the inevitable result of these prior events. A chain reaction.
So there's no real break in the chain, no point where you could have genuinely done something different.
That's the view. For them, the possible is just the future actual. Anything you think could happen is just what will happen in one specific way.
And the actual is just the past possible.
Right. What happened had to happen. It's
Well,
like life unfolding along a single track. Think of like a billiard ball.
Yeah.
Once it's hit, its path is set, assuming you know all the forces.
Okay. And the other side, the free willists, how do they see it?
Well, they offer a stark contrast. They argue that man and society actively cooperate with the efficient causes. They shape themselves, at least partly, toward their own ends.
Cooperate, so not just pushed along, but actively participating.
Precisely. And this introduces a crucial difference. For the free willist, the possible is genuinely one of several things that may be made to happen. This implies real choice, real alternatives. You could have done otherwise.
And they talk about final causes, not just efficient ones.
Yes. And final here means purpose-driven, like a goal, an intention, a reason why you're acting.
So it's not just cause and effect, like dominoes falling?
Exactly. Think of it like this. For a determinist, the universe is maybe like a complex clockwork. Every gear turn is caused by the last one.
Oh?
For the free willist, the clockwork might exist, sure. But there's also an operator, you, the human agent, who can choose which gears to engage, maybe even add a new force, based on a purpose you have in mind.
Agency. It's about having that power to initiate something.
Yes, to direct outcomes towards your own ends, not just be carried along by what came before.
So as you're listening to this, think about your own experience. Which view resonates more? When you make decisions, do you feel genuinely in control, like you're shaping things?
Or do you sometimes feel like you're just playing out a script, almost sensing a predetermined path?
It's a deeply personal question. Your gut probably leans one way or the other, even if you haven't used these specific terms before. You know, our Dartmouth source also mentions this unique teaching approach, the Dartmouth spirit of inquiry. It says philosophy teachers guide students not to tell them what to think, but to show them how to think. I really like that.
Yeah, that's a great principle.
It stresses that philosophy cannot be learned, it must be thought. It's active, not passive. You have to engage.
And that's exactly the spirit we want to bring to this deep dive. Our goal here isn't to declare a winner in this, ancient, incredibly complex debate.
Right, we're not settling it today.
Definitely not. Instead, we want to present the arguments, the evidence, the insights from all our sources, from that 1911 monograph to Reddit comments, in a balanced, clear way.
So you, the listener, can engage critically.
Exactly. Empower you to weigh the evidence, think it through, and form your own informed conclusions.
We're providing the toolkit, basically, not the finished product.
That's a good way to put it. It aligns with Dartmouth's dedication to freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and the search for the ultimate truth.
Okay.
It means we're aiming for an unbiased exploration, letting the different viewpoints speak, and letting you do the important work of figuring it out for yourself, building that intellectual independence.
What's interesting is how this whole freedom versus determination thing isn't just about human behavior, right? The Dartmouth source points out these analogous issues everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. And these analogies really help us get oriented, widen our perspective. It's like seeing the same fundamental tension pop up in different areas.
Okay, like where?
Well, first take physics. The motion of physical objects, planets, billiard balls, whatever, is generally seen as determined by antecedent conditions and surrounding circumstances.
Right, basic cause and effect. EFMA, that sort of thing.
Exactly. If you know the initial state and the forces, you can predict the outcome. So the natural quotient is human action just like that? Determined by prior physical and environmental factors.
That Reddit comment about chaos theory fits here, doesn't it?
It does. The user mentioned how even a single moment in your childhood can make a big difference 10 years later. Chaos theory deals with systems highly sensitive to initial conditions, but it's still fundamentally deterministic.
So even if we can't predict it easily because it's so complex,
the outcome is still theoretically determined by the starting point and the rules. It suggests this vast, intricate cause and effect machine operating everywhere, including inside us.
Okay, what else? Biology.
Yes, biology. Think about determinate variations like your eye color. That's congenital, hereditary. You didn't choose it.
Definitely didn't.
And then there's determinate evolution, shaped by physical causes, environmental pressures. So the big question becomes, is human action wholly due to these physical causes, genes, biology, environment?
Or does the mind itself play an active causal role? Is there something more than just biological reactions?
Exactly. Is it all nature and nurture, or is there a third element, this will or consciousness, that adds something? Then you see it in political science. Think about historical systems, the difference between a slave class and free men.
Clear determination versus some level of freedom there.
Absolutely. Or despotisms, where life is determined from above, versus constitutional monarchies, allowing more self-determination. Forces us to ask, are our actions determined by the system we live in? Or does individual agency have a real impact on the system?
That's a great parallel, the individual versus the structure.
And in economics, similar tensions. Debates like protection versus free trade.
Government control versus individual economic choice.
Right. Or restricted versus free labor. It mirrors that core tension between external determination and individual autonomy. Are markets purely deterministic forces? Or do our individual choices genuinely shape them?
It's everywhere once you start looking.
It really is. And finally, logic and psychology. They talk about mental determination. This view says your choice is wholly determined by its antecedent mental conditions.
So your thoughts, desires, memories, they all just add up to the choice you inevitably make.
That's the idea. It applies the scientific law of cause and effect directly to your mind. The Dartmouth source even says this isn't just an analogy, it's already a part of the philosophical problem.
Hmm.
It puts psychology firmly in the determinist camp from this perspective.
Wow. Seeing it laid out like that across different fields really highlights how deep this question runs. It's not just a niche philosophical thing.
Not at all. And it's crucial to remember what the source says. These analogies prove nothing. They suggest much.
Right, they don't settle the debate.
No, but they give us frameworks. They help us connect the dots, see the patterns of determinism and freedom across knowledge. They show this tension isn't unique to us. It's fundamental to how we understand the world. And these suggestions often get formalized into direct arguments, which we should probably get into next.
Okay, let's rewind the clock. How has humanity wrestled with this across different cultures and times? It's clearly not a new question.
Definitely not. If we look way back at, say, primitive societies, life was mostly governed by what the monograph calls practical determinism, basically a deep bondage to custom and tradition.
Meaning everyone just did what had always been done.
Pretty much. Daily life, eating, marriage, fighting, social stuff, religion, all dictated by strictest usage. If you deviated, you were quickly corrected, often harshly.
Why so strict?
Well, these customs were seen as vital for the group's survival. Stability was key, but it also made these societies very stationary, very resistant to change. Little room for individual choice outside the norm.
So very determined by tradition. Any exceptions?
Well, the monograph notes it wasn't absolute determinism. You had these early glimmers of primitive freedom. Maybe a chief or a shaman introduces a small variation to a custom, perhaps in response to something new. That's a form of agency. And interestingly, while people didn't feel they had much freedom themselves, they often assigned it to their gods. Deities could act unpredictably, outside the rules.
Ah, right. So the gods had free will, even if people didn't.
Kind of. A great example is the ancient Saxon idea of weird. It means fate, often personified as a death goddess.
Like in Beowulf.
Exactly. Beowulf says, "To us it shall be as our weird betides, that weird that is every man's lord." Strong sense of destiny, right?
Yeah, it's such a fatalistic.
But then Beowulf immediately says he takes up his strife with the fiend, go the weird as it will. He acts against fate, struggles despite it. It perfectly captures that tension, belief in fate, but also human defiance.
Okay, so a struggle even then. What about the ancient Orient? Did they formalize these ideas more?
They did. They moved beyond just practical custom to develop conscious philosophies of life, adding layers of doctrine. In East India, you get karma, the idea that deeds in a past life control your present. Your path feels pretty fixed.
Right, paying off old debts, essentially.
Kind of. In Mohammedanism, you have a strong fatalistic view with the will of Allah. The Quran says, "Every man's fate hath God fastened about his neck." Very deterministic.
Oh.
In China, the will of heaven is maybe less personal, but still deterministic. Confucius saying, "Rotten wood cannot be carved," suggesting inherent limits you can't overcome.
So mostly leaning towards determinism.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
But there are important exceptions. Zoroastrianism presented a clear choice between good and evil armies. You had to pick a side.
So agency comes in there.
Definitely. And more prominently, in the Hebrew tradition, the prophet Elijah challenges people directly. "Choose ye this day whom you will serve." That's a powerful call to agency. It brings in a stronger moral element, emphasizing personal responsibility, which is maybe less pronounced in Brahmanism or Buddhism cycles or the more fatalistic parts of Islam.
So the choice has real moral weight.
Exactly. Obedience should be freely chosen.
And their theology, how did their view of the divine fit in?
Well, it varied. Polytheism had many gods, sometimes capricious, maybe influenced by magic. Little crack for agency there. Pantheism, though, posits an impersonal God whose nature is determined, making everything necessarily what it is, a determined unfolding of the divine. So overall, while freedom flickers, determinism was pretty dominant in the ancient Orient.
Okay, let's move west to classical Greece and Rome. Powerful civilizations. How did they handle this question? Fate or choice?
Well, in Greece, popular thought definitely leaned towards fate. Think of the three weird sisters, the Moirai or Fates. Clotho spins the thread of life, Lachesis measures it, and Atropos cuts it.
Can't argue with Atropos and her scissors, right?
Exactly. It conveys a strong sense of predetermined destiny. Philosophically, the Stoics were major determinists. They believed everything happened according to a rational cosmic plan.
Which led them to say no one's really to blame for vice.
Right, because it was all part of the plan. Plutarch famously rejected that, finding it morally problematic because it seemed to erase responsibility.
But Greece wasn't all fate and determinism, was it? There were champions of freedom.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Key thinkers pushed back hard. Prodicus used the choice of Hercules. Hercules facing a clear, conscious choice between virtue and vice. Deliberate moral selection.
A very direct illustration.
Very. And Plato, in the Republic, has the incredible myth of souls choosing their next destiny before reincarnating.
Right. The prophet says, your genius will not be allotted to you, but you will choose your genius.
The responsibility is with the chooser. God is justified. Powerful stuff. It puts agency squarely on the human soul. Plato reinforces this in his laws, saying God left qualities to the wills of individuals.
So Plato was firmly in the free will camp.
Seems so. Aristotle also argued the origin of actions is within man, implying choice. And Epicurus flat-out rejected necessity. He said the will is free, and that's the basis for responsibility, which makes us encounter blame and praise. He connected freedom directly to morality and social judgment.
A strong philosophical case for freedom, then. Did it show up in their politics?
In a way. The Greek city-states were famously independent, maybe too independent to unite firmly.
Right, always squabbling.
Which reflects that emphasis on individual agency and self-governance in their political decentralization. Each polis wanted to run itself.
Okay. And Rome, did they just copy the Greeks?
They inherited a lot, yeah. Virgil, the poet, continued the idea that the god's will becomes human fate, and even gods are sometimes subject to a higher fate, the Roman parse, like the Greek fates.
So fate still looms large.
It does. And the philosophical split continued. Roman Stoics preached determinism and living according to universal reason. Roman Epicureans championed freedom, though sometimes critics felt it slid into license, irresponsible freedom.
Right.
Ovid's description of Medea's internal struggle, love for Jason versus loyalty to her father, that's a classic depiction of the will battling itself, deliberating between options.
So Rome had both deterministic and libertarian ideas floating around. What about practically in their society?
Well, Republican Rome managed this impressive, firm, and equal balance between the freedom of popular assemblies, citizen participation, and the authority and wisdom of the Senate.
A mix of freedom and structure.
Exactly. Made being a Roman citizen a big deal. But they had slavery, deeply ingrained, considered an ordination of nature. So freedom was definitely not universal.
A major contradiction.
A huge one. And the Dartmouth source makes a fascinating point. As the empire grew, absolutism increased and strength decreased.
Suggesting a link between losing freedom and declining power.
That's the implication. As freedom went, weakness came. Think of later emperors with absolute power, but presiding over a weaker, less innovative empire.
Interesting historical observation.
Yeah. But despite all that, the Roman people were known for their initiative, endurance, and achievement, suggesting a drive beyond pure determinism. Something about human will still shone through.
Religious traditions add whole other layers to this, right? Divine will, ultimate purpose. How do our sources tackle that?
Yeah, it gets really complex here. Take the Hebrew tradition. Now, you can find Old Testament passages that sound deterministic, like God hardening Pharaoh's heart against Moses.
Right, that comes up a lot.
It does. But the source stresses that, overall, ancient Hebrew life and thought overwhelmingly presuppose freedom. The law itself, given by God, presents a fundamental choice between good and evil, blessing and cursing, life and death.
The choice is central to the covenant relationship.
Exactly. Obedience is key, but it has to be chosen obedience. There's a great quote from Ecclesiasticus rejecting divine blame. Say not thou, it is through the Lord that I fell away. He himself made man from the beginning, and left him in the hand of his own counsel. If thou wilt, thou shalt keep the commandments.
Thou wilt. That puts the choice squarely on the individual.
Absolutely. And to perform faithfulness is of thine own good pleasure. It strongly underlines inherent human choice and its consequences. God grants autonomy.
Okay. What about early Christianity, Paul and Jesus? How do they fit in?
It's complex there, too. Paul, for instance, has passages that seem deterministic. The famous plotter has a right over the clay analogy in Romans 9.
Shaping people for different purposes.
That's one reading. Or his discussions of foreordination in Romans 8, suggesting God's plan. Yet, despite this theology, Paul constantly urged active choice. Quench not the spirit.
And his life was anything but passive.
Exactly. The source calls it the practicality of Paul. He lived with incredible energy and purpose, as if every choice mattered hugely, even while writing things that sounded deterministic. His actions screamed agency.
Okay, and Jesus.
Jesus consistently recognized people's freedom. He often asked, "What wilt thou? What do you want me to do?" acknowledging their choice in the matter.
Right, he didn't just impose healing or help.
No. And he affirmed his own will strongly. I laid down my life of myself, no man taketh it from me. That implies self-determination, even in sacrifice.
And Gethsemane, the prayer, thy will not mine be done.
A profound illustration of a free choice to align his will with the Father's, not compulsion. But then, interestingly, after making that choice, he says, the Son of Man indeed goeth as it hath been determined.
Paradox. Free choice leads to a determined outcome.
It seems so. The source suggests both Paul and Jesus lived this dynamic tension, acting as though all depended upon themselves, but thought and prayed as though all depended upon God. A powerful combination of agency and surrender.
Wow. So how did the early church handle this tension? Was there agreement?
Not even close. The early church fathers were deeply divided. On the deterministic side, emphasizing God's absolute sovereignty and human dependence, you had figures like Justin Martyr, St. Jerome, and especially St. Augustine.
Augustine's view is pretty famous, right? Original sin.
Hugely influential. He believed God made man free, but Adam's sin destroyed that freedom. So salvation and any good could only come through God's irresistible grace. You couldn't choose it yourself. The Gnostics also had deterministic views.
Okay, so a strong deterministic camp. Who argued for free will?
Plenty of big names. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Chrysostom, they all stressed human agency and moral accountability.
And Pelagius. He caused quite a stir, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. Pelagius radically denied original sin's effects, asserting complete free will and the possibility of sinlessness through human effort. Grace just helped, it didn't compel. A direct challenge to Augustine.
That sounds like a major theological battle.
It was. And later the Scotists, followers of Duns Scotus, argued both God and humans have free will, and the will is independent of reason. It can choose against logic. This whole clash between Augustine's grace-focused view and Pelagius's freedom-focused view really set the stage for centuries of debate in Christianity about responsibility and salvation.
Okay, so this debate keeps evolving through the Middle Ages and into modern times, reflecting societal changes and new scientific ideas. How did the medieval period specifically view free will in practice?
Well, in practice, the medieval period was largely characterized by determinism rather than freedom. Society was very hierarchical, and the church was the determining institution.
Meaning it controlled most aspects of life.
Pretty much. Both how people lived and how they thought. Any liberty of thinking had to stay within, not beyond, the doctrines of the church. It was a unified system, but very rigidly defined. Individual agency, at least outwardly, was really constrained by that institutional authority.
Dissent wasn't really an option.
Not safely, no. It was often heresy.
And the Reformation, did that automatically mean more free will? I know Luther and Calvin had strong views.
Not necessarily, especially in the Orthodox forms. Reformation theology was often strongly deterministic. Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk, wrote On the Bondage of the Will, arguing powerfully against free will.
Oh, why? What was his reasoning?
He believed that acknowledging free will would detract from the free grace of God. It would make salvation seem like something humans earned rather than a free gift from God.
Okay, and Calvin?
John Calvin centered his whole system on predestination. He asserted that your eternal destiny, salvation, or damnation was predestined by God's original purpose before you were even born.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah. He taught that Adam's sin led to total depravity for everyone, making genuine free choice impossible without God's irresistible intervention. Both Luther and Calvin aimed to glorify God by emphasizing his absolute sovereignty.
So major figures of the Reformation were actually quite deterministic theologically.
In their core doctrines, yes. Even later in 1902, the Presbyterian Church affirmed God choosing an innumerable multitude. And the Jansenists within Catholicism also held similar deterministic views.
But there must have been pushback within Protestantism, too.
Oh, definitely. A powerful countercurrent was Arminianism, named after the Dutch theologian Arminius.
What did he argue?
He asserted that man may resist divine grace, and that man may fall from divine grace. Basically, salvation wasn't solely determined by God's irresistible will. Humans had a genuine choice to accept or reject grace, and could even lose it.
That sounds much more like free will. How was it received?
It was condemned by the Synod of Dort, but Macaulay, the historian, notes it spread fast and wide, because it felt more agreeable to the popular notions of the divine justice and benevolence. It seemed fairer.
Makes sense.
And its influence, through people like Archbishop Laud and especially John Wesley, founder of Methodism, significantly softened the rigorous determinism in many Protestant groups, a big shift towards emphasizing human agency.
Okay, so a theological swing back towards freedom. What about modern philosophy outside of religion? Did determinism stick around?
It did. Thinkers like Baruch Spinoza continued the deterministic line, seeing everything as necessary parts of a single divine substance. And this connects back to that Reddit comment on chaos theory, right? Complex systems, but still determined.
Right, the underlying rules are fixed. But libertarian ideas flourish too.
Absolutely. René Descartes, father of modern philosophy, acknowledged free will but worried it led to error. But Immanuel Kant saw freedom as essential, a fundamental postulate of the moral life. His famous line, "Man ought, therefore he can."
Meaning if we have a moral duty, we must be free to fulfill it.
Exactly. For Kant, freedom is transcendent, outside the normal cause and effect chain, able to initiate a new causal series. German idealists like Fichte and Hegel extended this, emphasizing moral, intellectual, political freedom, defining the person as a free individual.
Okay.
The Scottish school with Thomas Reid argued for freedom based on our natural conviction of it, our sense of moral responsibility, and our ability to follow through on plans.
Common sense arguments, basically.
Pretty much. And then you have pragmatism, the very American movement with William James, F.C.S. Schiller, Henri Bergson. They staunchly advocated freedom, focusing on its practical benefits and usefulness.
So lots of philosophical support for freedom, too. Did this translate into real-world changes, practical freedom?
Bad time. The French Revolution is often seen as the turning point, destroying the old deterministic, absolutistic, autocratic order and kicking off modern political freedom.
A radical shift away from determined hierarchies.
Exactly. The historian Guizot, critiquing Louis XIV's absolute rule, showed how absolute power, practical determinism, leads to weak institutions and ultimately weakness. Free institutions, in contrast, provide stability with progress.
Because they allow for diverse inputs and adaptation.
Precisely. Modern freedom emerged, characterized by freedom of action, freedom from caste, social mobility, freedom of initiative, limited only by not harming others, equal freedom. Though even then, some worried about too much freedom.
Right, the potential for chaos. That's a constant tension, too.
It is.
So looking back at this whole historical sweep, there seems to be a trend, doesn't there?
There really does. The overarching pattern seems to be, historically, determinism has been the waning orthodoxy and freedom the waxing heresy. The fight is long, it's hard, it's not over. But determinism often represents the finite crust and shell of social habit, while freedom is the infinite returning spring, the dynamic force pushing for change and progress.
Okay, so with that historical context, let's dig into the actual arguments for determinism. Why do people find it so compelling? All right, the case for determinism. Often, the strongest arguments come from the sciences, right? Suggesting our actions are just part of this unbreakable chain of cause and effect, like we're just cogs in a big machine.
That's a very common line of argument, yeah.
Yeah.
It often starts with physics and the principle of the conservation of physical energy.
Energy can't be created or destroyed, only changed.
Exactly. So the argument goes, if every human action, moving, speaking, even thinking, is ultimately a physical effect involving energy transfer,
Which it is, biologically.
right, then it must have a solely physical cause. This view basically precludes any non-physical psychical cause, like a will stepping in out of nowhere to start something without a prior physical trigger.
So no room for a non-physical mind to influence the physical body.
Not according to this strict physicalist interpretation. It suggests our actions are so mechanically determined that an omniscient observer of the present could predict infallibly all futurity.
Like Laplace's demon, the hypothetical being that knows everything and can predict everything.
Precisely. And again, this connects to chaos theory complex, yes, but still fundamentally determined by initial conditions and physical laws. The universe, including us, is seen as just this incredibly complex but ultimately predictable clockwork.
Okay, so physics provides a very mechanistic worldview. What about biology?
Biology adds another layer. It views humans fundamentally as animals. Our actions are explained by our capacities, our inherited traits, our genes, and the stimuli from our environment.
Nature and nurture, basically.
Exactly. Our responses, our behaviors, are just the effects of those two forces interacting. The argument poses the question, if this explains animal behavior pretty well,
Like why a dog salivates at a bell.
right, why shouldn't it also fully explain human behavior, even complex stuff? We're just higher animals. The organism is seen as a parallelogram of forces. Our behavior is just a predictable result of competing biological drives and environmental pushes and pulls.
That seems to cover a lot of ground. Does it get even more specific, like looking at the brain itself?
It does. That brings us to physiology and the really impactful conscious automaton theory, famously pushed by Thomas Huxley.
Conscious automaton, meaning we're like robots that just happen to be aware.
That's the idea. Man is a conscious automaton. Our actions, however complex they seem, follow automatic mechanistic patterns, like a very sophisticated machine. And while we are conscious while acting,
We feel like we're deciding.
right, but that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon,
Epiphenomena. Okay, break that down again. Like the exhaust fumes.
exactly like the exhaust fumes. It's a byproduct of the brain's physical activity, but it doesn't cause anything. It stands outside the causal chain. Your thoughts, feelings, intentions, they're just along for the ride. They don't steer the car.
So we're conscious machines, but our consciousness doesn't actually do anything to cause our actions.
That's the theory. Our acts are in no sense attributable to his conscious purposes. Now, this might feel repellent to our feelings, obviously,
Yeah, it definitely undermines our sense of self.
but it's attractive to some scientists because it fits neatly with the principle that like effects have like causes. Human action is a physical effect, so it must have a purely physical cause. Brain chemistry, neural pathways, no need for a mysterious mind intervening.
Okay. And psychology has its own deterministic arguments, too.
Yes, the argument from mental determination. It says all the elements in consciousness at any time, thoughts, memories, emotions, desires, cooperate toward an end state, which we call choice or decision.
Cooperate, meaning they all push in one direction.
Essentially, yes. The key point is that the choice is wholly determined by its antecedent mental conditions. Every mental event is caused by prior mental events. It just applies the scientific law of cause and effect directly to our inner mental life. Introspection is just observing this determined chain unfold.
So even our thoughts aren't free. They're just determined by previous thoughts.
According to this view, yes. And finally, you have sociology and the argument from statistical constancy.
Ah, the predictability of crowds.
Right. It points out that supposedly free will acts are really capable of prediction in the mass, like marriage rates, crime rates, even suicide rates. Statisticians can often predict these with surprising accuracy.
Even though each individual feels they're making a unique, free choice.
Exactly. The implication is that these individual free choices somehow average out into determined, predictable patterns at the societal level. So the monograph says, sociology as a science speaks for determinism. Our collective behavior seems predictable, hence determined. Hashtag tag 3.2 ethical and theological arguments for determinism.
Okay, beyond the science, determinism also draws strength from ethical arguments and theology. These can really shift how we think about blame, responsibility, and our place in the grand scheme of things.
Definitely. From an ethical standpoint, a common determinist argument is that a person's character determines his acts.
You act according to the kind of person you are.
Right. So you're responsible in the sense that the act came from you, from your character.
Mm-hmm.
But being the man he is, he could not have done otherwise. If your character is fixed by your past experiences, genetics, etc., and your character dictates your actions.
Then your actions are determined. But what does that do to blame? If you couldn't have done otherwise, how can we blame you in a moral sense?
That's the intuitive hurdle.
Yeah.
But determinists argue you can still give real meaning and a sufficient justification to feelings like remorse or practices like accountability, even without free will.
How?
Well, you can still recognize that an action, even if determined, doesn't align with a desired ideal or social norm. Remorse isn't about, I could have chosen differently, but more like my determined character produced an undesirable outcome that needs correction.
So it's more about identifying faulty programming almost and trying to fix it for the future.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. It shifts the focus from backward-looking blame to forward-looking consequences and potential modification of behavior or character.
Okay. And the theological arguments. Predestination and foreknowledge.
Very powerful arguments, especially historically, drawing from figures like Paul, Augustine, Luther, Calvin. The core idea revolves around God's foreknowledge.
If God knows everything that will happen,
Then there can only be one reality. There aren't two possibilities awaiting me in the future. If God already knows you're going to do X tomorrow, then when tomorrow comes, you are not free to do otherwise than you must do.
because doing otherwise would make God's knowledge wrong.
Exactly. To deny God's perfect foreknowledge, the argument goes, would be derogatory to his dignity. to his omniscience. This leads directly into predestination, the idea that God determined everyone's eternal destiny from the beginning. Your fate is sealed by his original purpose.
It's a very strong theological position. It makes human choice seem almost irrelevant to the ultimate outcome.
It can feel that way, and the Dartmouth source adds a really interesting psychological observation here. It suggests that our beliefs are due more to our feelings and preferences than to our ideas.
Meaning we choose the philosophy that feels right, then find reasons for it.
Kind of. It suggests that our deep intuitions or emotional leanings, maybe a desire for order or awe at divine power, might pull us towards determinism first. Then, the rational arguments we use often serve more to confirm oneself in that feeling, rather than objectively convince opponents.
Even for professional philosophers.
Even for them, the source suggests. There's this powerful underlying emotional draw to one side or the other, influencing how we weigh the evidence for determinism or free will.
Okay, let's flip the coin. The case for free will, this often feels much more intuitive, right?
Yeah.
Rooted in our direct, everyday experience of actually making choices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the starting point for many free will arguments, our inner sense. The monograph talks about a natural conviction of freedom of the will, and it makes this really strong point. The sense of freedom is there. Those who deny freedom, nevertheless, feel free.
Even a determinist feels like they're choosing their lunch.
Exactly. That subjective experience, that feeling of agency, is presented as primary evidence. Building on that, the argument suggests it's most unlikely that there should be a general delusion on this point. We have direct access to our own consciousness through introspection. Why would we be universally mistaken about something so fundamental?
The source uses an analogy, right, about feeling sick.
Yeah, a simple but effective one. If we feel sick, we generally are sick. If we feel well, we are well. So the argument goes, if we feel free, we are free.
It's trusting our direct experience.
Right. The source argues, no purpose would be served in the economy of nature by general delusion. Why would evolution give us this powerful feeling of freedom if it wasn't real? Nature isn't trying to trick us, it argues. We're not all crazy, nor all deluded. Our internal experience should be taken seriously.
It makes intuitive sense. If consciousness tells us we're choosing, dismissing that feels weird, like denying the evidence of our own senses.
Exactly. And that leads to a philosophical problem for determinism. If determinism says, yes, you feel free, but you're not actually free, it creates this paradox. Consciousness trusting itself and distrusting itself.
Huh. Can you unpack that?
It means your consciousness is reporting the feeling of freedom, but then you're using that same consciousness to decide its own report is false. It's like using your eyes to decide your eyes can't be trusted.
Right. It undermines itself.
Precisely. The source argues consciousness is the final bar of judgment. If we can't trust its most basic reports about itself, like the experience of choosing, then what can we trust? Denying the feeling of freedom seems to risk undermining the very possibility of knowledge. Hashtag 4.2 moral responsibility and the sense of effort.
Okay, so if we trust that inner sense of freedom, what follows? What does it mean for things like morality, accountability, and even just the effort we put into things?
Huge implications. The argument from man's responsibility is central. We feel like responsible people. This feeling is tied directly to believing our decisions are of his own making.
That you could have chosen differently.
Yes, that you could have picked any one of several paths. And because of that, you cannot shirk the duty of deliberating and choosing. You feel like a center of causality, an originator of action.
Not just a link in a chain.
Exactly. And crucially, without free will, you could only bewail his fate, like those Greek tragic figures doomed by destiny. But the source argues he could not repent of his sin.
That distinction again between regret and repentance. Explain that.
Regret is wishing things were different. Repentance, true moral remorse, requires the belief that you could have and should have acted differently. It implies genuine culpability based on choice. If your actions were determined, deep repentance doesn't really make sense. Only maybe regret or sadness about the inevitable outcome.
That really highlights the moral dimension. And the monograph made an interesting cultural point here, too, about introspection.
Yeah, it observed that Orientals, often embracing more fatalistic views, were seen as meditative, but not necessarily introspective in the Western psychological sense. They didn't produce introspective psychology.
Whereas Westerners,
often accepting freedom, are described as both very busy and active and introspective. The source suggests they find freedom by introspecting. It hints at a connection. Maybe the act of looking inward reinforces the belief in, or experience of, free will.
interesting cultural link. And what about Calvinism, which was deterministic but seem to foster freedom.
That's the paradox. Even though Calvinism denied formal free will, it was historically associated with the doctrine of resistance to oppressive sovereigns.
Like the Puritans fighting monarchs.
Exactly. So in practice, this deterministic theology somehow fostered political freedom, in fact. People acted with fierce agency, believing that they answered to God, not kings.
Okay. What about the feeling of effort? Does that support free will?
The argument says yes. Some decisions feel easy, habitual, but others require real effortful struggle resisting temptation, pushing through difficulty. This effortful type of reaching and executing a decision shows the man himself is doing something. He is rowing, not drifting.
The struggle itself implies you could choose to stop struggling.
Precisely. The very possibility of giving up the struggle implies an alternative. This effort is guided by purpose, a forward-looking final cause, a goal. It's not just a reaction to past events. That's why the source says science, even psychology, can't have the last word because they primarily deal with efficient causes.
And that line, the brain was made for thought, not thought for the brain.
Powerful, isn't it? It suggests the mind uses the brain rather than just being a product of it, that consciousness is the driver, not just the passenger.
Okay. And our feelings about right and wrong, satisfaction and remorse.
They're inherently associated with freedom. Feeling genuine satisfaction for doing right or deep remorse for doing wrong only makes sense if you believe you had a choice. If it was all determined, the emotions would be more like humiliation and despair, feeling bad about an outcome you couldn't control, like being a mere puppet.
Right, the moral sting requires choice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, the social argument from praise and blame. It's woven into our society. When someone acts rightly under temptation, choosing future good over present pleasure, we feel merit and desert are present. We offer praise, maybe even artificial reward.
Like promotions, bonuses, good grades.
Right. Conversely, when bad choices are made, we condemn the act and blame the person, feeling demerit, sometimes inflicting punishment, all based on the assumption that law has been willfully disobeyed.
Our whole justice system, our everyday moral judgments.
They fundamentally presuppose freedom. Without it, the concepts of desert, merit, blame, and justice, as we intuitively understand them, just seem to collapse.
Okay, we've heard the strong deterministic arguments from science, ethics, theology. Now, how do the free will proponents push back? Let's go through those rebuttals. How do they counter the physics argument, for example?
Right, the rebuttal to physics and the conservation of energy. The free willist argues, look, conservation of energy is a powerful principle, maybe even a law within the physical system, but calling it a universal fact that must apply absolutely to the mind-brain interaction is an hypothesis, not proven.
Especially since we don't fully understand how mind and brain interact anyway.
Exactly. The source argues that our direct experience of freedom is more obviously a fact than the absolute universal application of this physical hypothesis to consciousness itself. Our inner certainty of choice outweighs the physical theory's claim to universality here.
Okay, what about the biology argument that we're just animals determined by heredity and environment?
The rebuttal to biology says that argument assumes in a universal form the very thing to be proved. It assumes humans are just animals in the relevant sense, without establishing that all animal action is purely determined anyway.
It's a bit circular.
Yeah. It doesn't deny similarities, but challenges the claim of total identity that erases human agency. Plus, the rebuttal points out that biology itself uses terms like selection and struggle for existence, which sound kind of like agency. And evolutionary theory is often teleological, purpose-driven.
Like explaining things by their function or goal.
Right. And J.M. Baldwin's theory of organic selection suggested the individual animal helps to make himself through its choices and adaptations. He gives the organism an active role.
Okay, now, the big one. The rebuttal to physiology, the conscious automaton theory. How do they argue consciousness isn't just an exhaust fume?
The rebuttal to physiology uses evolution against itself. Key principle of evolution is useful traits survive, useless ones atrophy and disappear.
Right, use it or lose it.
So if consciousness were truly useless, a mere epiphenomenon with no causal power, it should have been eliminated long ago. Instead, its grade has been constantly increasing throughout evolution.
Suggesting it has a function.
A crucial one. Its function is to serve as the test of what is beneficial and what detrimental. It guides behavior, helps us learn, adapt. Therefore, consciousness must be a contributory cause of action.
It has survival value.
Exactly. The source also uses the analogy of artificial fertilization. Scientists can stimulate pre-existing life, but not create it from scratch, suggesting an inherent life force beyond pure mechanism. It concludes, real machines are destructive, the live things of nature are constructive, and crucially, machines need intelligent designers. So who designed the natural machine, the organism? It implies a mind behind the machine. Mechanism itself is a construction of the human mind.
So determinism is a product of our minds, not the ultimate reality governing them.
That's the implication for psychology's mental determination. The rebuttal clarifies that assuming determinism for scientific study, methodological determinism, is just a research strategy, not proof that reality is deterministic.
It's a tool, not a fact.
Right, and it emphasizes that attention involves energy of attention and is conscious. This means each person is a center of conscious force, and as such is capable of self-direction. The real cause of attention isn't just a prior brain state, efficient cause, but purpose, final cause. Science itself, including psychology, only has significance because of our purpose to understand.
Okay. And the sociology argument about predictable crowds.
The rebuttal to sociology acknowledges that, yeah, in crowds, little or no free will is evidenced. Mob mentality takes over. Conditions don't allow for deliberation. But it emphasizes men sometimes also deliberate and choose in private, away from the crowd.
Like the lone inventor, the solitary artist, the great leader making a tough call.
Exactly. Indeed, our greatest men decide in solitude. That's where real impactful choices happen. Plus, social predictions are often inexact, just probabilities, not certainty.
What about the ethical argument character determines acts?
The rebuttal to ethics agrees character is influential, but adds two big caveats. One, in kids and adolescents, acts determine the character as much as the other way around. Early free choices shape their developing character.
So character isn't fixed from the start.
Right. And two, no character is finally fixed, even in adults. People can act out of keeping with their established patterns. The reliable person embezzles, the ad gets clean. This shows a remnant of freedom persists. We're not completely prisoners of our past selves.
Okay. And finally, the theological arguments about foreknowledge and predestination.
The rebuttal to theology suggests the conflict isn't necessarily irreconcilable. It proposes maybe God's foreknowledge may be so perfect that God knows what I will freely do, what I am freely doing.
So God knows it because it's a free choice, not that his knowing causes it to be determined.
Precisely. His perfect knowledge accurately reflects a free reality. It harmonizes omniscience and free will. Similarly, divine sovereignty doesn't have to exclude human responsibility. Maybe God's sovereign plan includes and works through our genuine freedom.
So these rebuttals basically argue that deterministic explanations aren't as conclusive as they seem, especially when you factor in consciousness, purpose, and our direct experience.
That's the core of it. And one last point. The historical argument itself, the trend of freedom waxing and determinism waning, is presented as evidence. It suggests that progress and societal flourishing are tied to believing in and exercising freedom. History itself seems to argue for free will.
Okay, so we've got arguments for both sides, but thinking practically, if free will exists, it's not unlimited, right? We can't just choose to flap our arms and fly. The sources talk about limitations.
Absolutely. And understanding these limits is crucial. It gives nuance to the idea of freedom. It's not absolute power, but agency within constraints.
What are some of these limits?
First, there's capacity. Our choices are obviously constrained by our inherent abilities, talents, physical limits. Choosing something way beyond your capacity is usually futile.
Like me choosing to be an NBA star tomorrow. Not going to happen.
Exactly. Wisdom means making choices only in the light of the knowledge of one's capacities. The source says, to know, to accept, to work within one's limitations is requisite for successful living. Choose effectively within what's possible for you.
Makes sense. What else?
Opportunity. You can only choose from something that offers. Opportunities are described as a gift of environment. You can't choose to be a sailor if you're nowhere near water.
Right, your circumstances limit your options.
Yes. A more complex environment might offer more opportunities, but also more strain. While we don't usually make opportunities from nothing, we can choose to move to an environment with more possibilities. But still, without opportunity, there is no choice. Freedom needs a context to operate in.
Okay, capacity and opportunity. Anything else?
Labor. This is a big one. Making a choice isn't the same as achieving the outcome. To choose is not to have, but only to begin to have.
The choice is just the first step.
Right. It's a link in a chain where consequence include labor. You choose to build a house, you still must work it out. You choose to run a marathon, you still have to train and run it. Labor is the posterior limit to choice. Choice initiates, effort realizes.
Got it. And the last one was habit.
Yes, habit. Let's be honest, a lot of our daily life runs on autopilot. driven by habit, not conscious choice. Our real choices are few, though momentous.
Like deciding your career or partner or values.
Exactly. The source notes that one choice may initiate a long train of action, even a whole lifetime of endeavor, requiring thereafter only minor choices in accord with the initial major choice. Those big choices set a path where many smaller actions follow more or less automatically.
So these limits capacity, opportunity, labor, habit. They don't erase free will.
No, the argument is they provide for it.
Yeah.
They define the playing field, the parameters within which our agency actually operates. It's freedom within reality, not freedom from it. Hashtag tag tag 5.2 implications for justice and education.
This whole debate has massive implications for society, especially for things like education and the justice system. These aren't just abstract ideas, they affect real people's lives profoundly. How does education look through, say, a deterministic lens?
Well, from a deterministic viewpoint, like the philosopher Herbart suggested, education is really the process of determining pupils through environment to be what they ought to be.
Shaping them, essentially.
Exactly. Children are seen as fundamentally determinable. The focus is on controlling the whole interaction of the man's physical and mental nature with the forces of his entire environment. To mold him correctly, strengthen weaknesses, instill virtues, it's about optimizing the inputs to get the desired output. Careful conditioning.
Okay, that makes sense from that perspective. But the justice system, that's where it gets really tricky ethically. Blame, punishment, responsibility. How does determinism handle that?
It's hugely challenging. There's a growing trend, influenced by deterministic thinking, to look beyond the individual and blame heredity, environment, associations, training for misconduct.
So it wasn't entirely their fault. They were shaped by forces beyond their control.
That's the implication. If actions are determined, then traditional moral blameworthiness fades. Punishment shifts from retribution, getting what you deserve, towards reformation, or simply protecting society. Plato argued rational punishment looks to the future, not retaliating for the past.
So criminals are seen more as victims of circumstances.
Potentially, yes, requiring treatment or containment rather than just deserved suffering. It leads to ideas like tempering the wind to the shorn lamb, showing leniency, and the virtuous are seen less as heroes and more as children of good fortune. It removes that strong sense of personal moral desert.
And modern neuroscience is pouring fuel on this fire, isn't it? Finding physical correlates for behavior in the brain.
It really is. Researchers like Green and Cohen, mentioned in the Wikipedia article on moral responsibility, argue neuroscience is undermining libertarian intuitions. They say the brain, the physical system, causes action, not some non-physical will.
Citing examples like brain damage leading to crime.
Exactly. Frontal lobe damage, tumors altering behavior, or reduced frontal activity in adolescence explaining impulsivity, even neglect affecting brain development. It suggests biology plays a huge role.
David Eagleman's work comes to mind here.
Yes, Eagleman argues strongly against the illusion that decisions are independent of our physiology and history. His famous example is the schoolteacher whose pedophilia appeared and disappeared with the growth and removal of brain tumors.
Suggesting the behavior was caused by the tumor, not free choice.
That's his interpretation. He advocates for a forward-looking legal system focused on managing risk, rehabilitation, changing behavior, and brain function, not on narrow culpability and retribution. He even points out biases in sentencing as evidence we need more science, less subjective judgment.
So the brain is the person. If the brain is affected, responsibility is affected. That's radical.
It is. It leads to proposals like Dirk Perboom's, suggesting we handle dangerous criminals like we handle carriers of dangerous diseases, quarantine them for public safety, based on the right to self-defense, not because they deserve punishment.
Like a public health model for crime.
Exactly. Focused on incapacitation, rehabilitation, reintegration, minimizing harm, rather than retributive justice based on the assumption of free will and deserved blame. A fundamental shift.
Okay, what about pragmatism? That American philosophy focused on practical consequences. How does it approach this whole free will versus determinism thing? Does it just ask which belief is more useful?
That's basically it. Pragmatism, with figures like William James, F.C.S. Schiller, Henri Bergson, staunchly advocated freedom. They generally felt the belief in free will was more beneficial, more empowering, more energizing for human life.
The proof of the pudding is in the eating idea.
Exactly. If a theory works well in practice, helps us live better, then it's considered true, or at least the one we should adopt.
But does that actually settle the truth question?
Well, the Dartmouth source argues no, it can't definitively discover the objective truth, because freedom is the theory that works well for the free willist and is therefore true to him, and determinism is the theory that works well for the determinist and is therefore true to him.
So both sides can claim their view works for them.
Right. You get contradictory intellectual views regularly give the same emotional satisfactions. If satisfaction or usefulness is the only measure of truth, then truth gets claimed by opposing views, which is logically messy. The monograph worries this means we follow feelings over reason and don't find objective truth.
It sounds like pragmatism gets stuck in subjectivity.
That's the criticism. And there's a logical flaw highlighted. Pragmatism often says all truths change. But if that statement itself must change,
Then it implies some truths don't change. It contradicts itself.
exactly. Like Heraclitus' paradox, everything flows. The statement itself can't flow. Pragmatism, the critique goes, confuses the ideal truth with a human view of it, potentially denying objective truth altogether.
What about specific pragmatists? Bergson had a unique take.
Henri Bergson argued freedom is real but indefinable. He saw the deep, authentic self as free, spontaneous, not bound by laws, because conscious experience duration is a unique, ever-changing flow. The same states are never repeated. Determinism, he thought, wrongly imposes spatial, static concepts onto this fluid reality of time and consciousness.
Okay. And Schiller, he had a paradoxical view too.
F.C.S. Schiller suggested human behavior inevitably betters himself and his offspring and cannot do otherwise. We are forced always to do so. But the source argues this isn't really meliorism, improvement through effort, but an inevitable optimism, strangely similar to determinism. If betterment is forced, it's not freely chosen.
So even trying to argue for freedom pragmatically can lead back to determinism.
Or at least blur the lines. The source feels that what free will offers is the right to believe that human behavior may better itself through choice. Forced betterment might even go beyond good and evil if progress is just automatic.
So pragmatism might be motivating, but maybe not philosophically rigorous enough on its own?
That's the conclusion from the Dartmouth source. Despite its energy, it provides poor argument for good doctrines regarding ultimate truth. We need an objective standard of truth, it suggests, something beyond just what feels good or works well in the short term.
All right, let's zoom out to the really big picture. How we think about free will seems deeply tied to how we think about reality itself, ontology, the study of what fundamentally exists.
Absolutely. Your underlying view of the universe, what it's made of, how it works, often pushes you towards either determinism or free will.
How so?
Well, take materialism. If you believe reality is fundamentally just physical stuff, atoms in the void, no spiritual principle, then that view is necessarily deterministic. Everything is just matter obeying physical laws. No room for non-physical choice.
Okay, materialism leads to determinism. What else?
Agnostic monism, often like pantheism, where everything is one substance, is also deterministic. If the one reality is neither personal nor self-directive, it just unfolds according to its inherent nature. Determined.
So, both materialism and pantheism lean deterministic. What about views that see more than one kind of reality?
Like dualism, mind and matter, or God and world. That can go either way. It's sometimes deterministic, like in some interpretations of Islam where God's will is absolute, but it's sometimes libertarian, like in Zoroastrianism, with a real cosmic struggle where human choice matters.
Okay, and idealism, where mind or spirit is primary.
Idealism is where the Dartmouth monograph largely positions itself. It also splits. Absolute idealism, like T.H. Green, often talks about freedom, but is customarily deterministic. Freedom means rational self-determination within a determined cosmic mind, though some, like Royce, found room for libertarian freedom within it. Pluralistic idealism, like William James, linked to pragmatism, is regularly libertarian. It sees reality as composed of many individual minds or centers of consciousness, each with genuine agency.
So where does that leave the modern debate, ontologically speaking?
Well, the monograph argued even back then that strict materialism was fading, and dualism was also less popular. It suggested a modern determinist would likely lean toward pantheism, while a modern libertarian would probably adopt some form of idealism.
And the main fight today.
It suggests the most interesting ontological fight today is between absolute idealism, one determined mind, and pluralistic idealism, many free minds, complicated further by the new realism, which, being closer to materialism, tends towards determinism. So it really forces you, the listener, back to that fundamental question. What kind of universe do you think we live in? one of mind and freedom, or one determined by underlying structures.
Okay, after covering all that ground, history, science, philosophy, theology, how do we pull it together? What actually explains human action and power, according to our sources? Where does our agency fit in?
The Dartmouth monograph offers a really neat, compact summary of human power. It breaks it down into three main factors.
Okay, what are they?
First, physical heredity. Our genes are biology, the stuff we inherit. Talents, constitution, temperament, given, not chosen.
Right, nature.
Second, social heredity. This is huge. It's care, education, language, culture, institutions, all the accumulated knowledge and structures of society that shape us. Nurture, basically.
Okay, nature and nurture. What's the third?
The third is his own efforts. Your choices, your exertion of will, your perseverance, your conscious striving.
Ah, so that's where the self comes in.
Exactly. Now, here's the key synthesis. The first two forces, physical and social heredity, help to determine man. They set the stage, the limits, the context. They're the deterministic influences.
The hand you're dealt, the game you're playing.
Right. But the third force, his own efforts, is where lies his freedom. It helps him to determine himself. It's the sphere of genuine agency, the ability to act within those determined contexts.
So the libertarian view doesn't deny heredity or environment.
Not at all. It can go two-thirds of the way with the determinist, acknowledging those powerful forces, but not all the way. It preserves a space for self-determination through effort.
And this justifies treating people differently based on their efforts.
The source argues yes. It says, it's just to treat men unequally so far their efforts are unequal. It links effort directly to deserved outcomes, grounding accountability in the choices we make within our given circumstances. Hashtag 6.3, the pragmatic contradiction in the magnitude of choice.
Before we wrap up, there's one last really fascinating point from the sources, this pragmatic contradiction. How we actually live versus what we might believe about free will.
Yeah, this is quite striking. Despite their philosophical positions, people's behavior often contradicts their stated beliefs. The determinist acts in daily life as though the future were incalculable and undetermined.
How so?
They still plan, study, work towards goals, settle arms, save money. They act as if their efforts make a difference, as if the future isn't already fixed, even if they intellectually believe it is. They strive.
Okay, and the libertarian?
Conversely, the libertarian acts as though the future were, to a degree, calculable and determined. They expect consequences, they rely on cause and effect, they trust patterns.
You don't jump off a building assuming free will lets you float.
Exactly. You expect gravity to have its determined effect. So in practice, our daily lives seem to require an operational belief in both freedom and determination. We live as if we choose, and as if choices have predictable consequences. Our behavior forces a kind of reconciliation.
That's a really interesting observation. Our actions betray a belief in both, regardless of our philosophy.
It seems so. And one final thought to really hammer home the importance of choice, from F.C.S. Schiller. Even differences of choices, which at first seem infinitesimal, may lead to growing divergencies and ultimately constitute all the difference between a world in which we are saved and one in which we are damned.
Wow. So even tiny choices can have massive divergent consequences over time.
That's the idea. It highlights the immense significance attributed to individual decisions, however small they might seem. They can set trajectories, shape futures, define outcomes in profound ways. It really puts the weight back on personal responsibility and the power, even if limited, of our choices. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground. We've navigated this incredibly intricate landscape of free will and determinism, explored how it touches everything: ancient customs, modern neuroscience, personal choices, societal structures, even fundamental reality.
And seen that the arguments are complex, they span millennia, across disciplines.
Yeah.
And a final definitive proof is, well, elusive. The Dartmouth text calls the issue ultimately speculative.
Yeah. Yet that human experience of responsibility, the idea of purpose, the moral fabric of our lives, it all keeps pointing towards a powerful role for choice, doesn't it?
It really does. The historical trend, that inner conviction of agency, the practical implications for justice, they all suggest this debate remains profoundly relevant, even without absolute certainty.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Here's a final thought drawn from our sources. If this debate isn't settled by scientific certainty or logical proof, but maybe rests on a reasonable and preponderant probability.
A weighing of the evidence, finding the better reason for pinning faith to one side rather than the other.
How do you decide where to pin your faith?
Do you choose to believe your choices genuinely shape your world? That you're really the author? Or do you lean towards seeing them as expressions of a determined path, the inevitable result of everything that came before?
And importantly, if it's the latter, how might that belief change how you feel about your own actions, satisfaction, remorse, or how you view others' praise, blame?
The very act of thinking about this, of wrestling with the question, that internal debate itself is an exercise in consciousness. And maybe, just maybe, it's an assertion of your own agency right there.
Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep making those deep dives into the knowledge that shapes our world.